Welcome to the last presentation of today. Just imagine where Max and me met each other the first time at SBB. Huh? So collaboration is the thing there across the rail industry. Happy to see the story here from you, Max, about a drama with happy end. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for staying with me here, especially since this is the last session before we are having drinks and barbecue. So, yeah, let's get through this. This presentation will be about open source maintainers. Obviously, you here in the room, probably 99% know what open source maintainers are. At least you heard the term, and I think that's true for many people these days in the IT industry, which wasn't the reality 5 years ago, perhaps. But still, I feel there are many misunderstandings about who open source maintainers are. What are they doing? How do they finance themselves? How many are there? We don't know. Yeah? I see that especially, or even in companies which happen to use a lot of open source software. So they should know better, like who are their peers actually? Who are they talking to? And this talk here, this drama, tries to improve the situation a little bit. But before we actually start with the topic and I start with the session, just two things. The first is I just quickly want to introduce myself for those who don't know me. My name is Max Mehl. I have been part of the open source or FOSS community since more than 10 years now, working in very different roles, also working for the FSFE, for instance, where I co-created the public money, public code that Matthias just recently talked about. These days I'm working with Deutsche Bahn, or DB Sister, which is the internal IT provider. And there I'm basically doing everything about open source management. And I'm part of what you would call the OSPO, although we are not called that way. And part of that is also that I was and still am quite involved in the Open Rail Association, which has been mentioned 2 times here already. That's awesome. I mean, especially since I'm the second rail person here on the stage today, that shows that the whole industry, the whole sector is improving quite a bit, and that's great. The second thing that I want to talk about or want to say beforehand is that I created this talk initially with my colleague Cornelius Schumacher, who is basically my counterpart at Deutsche Bahn in open source. And originally we added some interactive elements that you could describe it. Unfortunately, he cannot join us today, so I somehow have to compensate for that. So I'm already sorry for what you're about to see. Let's get started with the topic. Open source maintainers. I said already they have been in the news recently more than before. I mean, 5 years ago, I don't know whether you ever read the term open source maintainer in mainstream tech media or so. So I showcased here some of the examples where they appear in the news. This is one example here. There's a maintainer of 2 quite popular NPM packages, and 2 years ago he decided to sabotage his own projects in protest because he felt that companies weren't really giving back for what he was doing for the big corporations. So he sabotaged them and was also banned from GitHub for doing so. Oh man, maintainers, right? Oh no, Log4j, everyone remembers. They ruined my weekend and probably also many people's Christmas holidays and so on. So yeah, there were the maintainers, part of the Apache Software Foundation. They overlooked a critical vulnerability in their code, and that became public. And everyone was wondering how was that supposed to happen? Like, how could that happen that they overlooked this so obvious security vulnerabilities? Maintainers. Oh, XZ utils. You remember that just 1 or 2 months ago, yeah? There's a quite important project that probably no one ever heard before, at least most people writing these news articles. What happened? There was this rogue maintainer, who we still don't know who he is or they are, and they introduced vulnerable code or backdoors in this quite popular software, or most used software. heavily used software. And how was that possible? Because they exploited the original maintainer who was stressed out and was close to a burnout. Maintainers, right? If you read that, if you read these news, you could have the feeling, oh no, maintainers, they're unreliable, untrustworthy, and you could, or some people actually do wonder, can we even work with open source anymore since we rely on those people? Of course, you know in this room, yes, without them it wouldn't work. But yeah, this is what we are dealing with. I mean, they're actually humans. And what bothers me the most when I read these articles or such articles is it's very seldom that their names are actually written down. Does anyone know any of the maintainers that are involved in some of these projects? No. They have names, they are humans. And perhaps that's one of the most important lessons that we should draw away from this. Open source maintainers are humans. And in order to introduce you perhaps a little bit more to the world, or to also give you some arguments or some insights into how maintainers work and how different they are perhaps from the perspectives that we are in our work time. Cornelius and I created a drama and tried to make this more interactive, especially since it's the last session of the day. So, imagine me being a typical open source programmer. I have a great idea about a software that will solve my problems, and I'm just trying to write it down, and it compiles and it works. Great, excellent. So I will just publish it out to the world and put it on GitHub and make it open source. Hey world, do you want to use my cool open source project? Anyone? Anyone? Oh, actually there's someone calling, perhaps a user. Who could that be?
Hello, this is me from Super Duper Company.
Hey.
We just saw your tool. It's great. We love it. Thank you so much. So we are definitely going to use it.
Great, thank you. Contributions are welcome.
But there's a tiny problem. Our security officer needs something from you. So please fill in this 9 pages document and of course also sign our NDA. Until tomorrow, okay? Thanks, bye.
Bye. What? Huh? Okay. So it's obvious that this didn't really go well, right? And while this is of course quite exaggerated for what we see, we still see it sometimes in the present. Especially in the Log4j case, many maintainers complained about that companies were sending them huge documents and also their NDAs attached. So please fill in this form. Until tomorrow. So this is still the language that is somewhere spoken to regular open source maintainers. So we should better understand who these people are. And I promised you some drama. So a good Greek drama consists of 5 acts. So let's take a good story, like one of the stories that you could see in the wild, and we see the history or the evolution of a typical open source maintainer. So let's say here, let's meet Alex. Alex is a young developer, and Alex is very new to the open source world, but they have a lot of passion, and they want to fix a problem and want, with a clear vision, improve the way how we are creating software, let's say so. And so they start as a one-person team and they just start coding because they want to create something better, mostly for themselves. And that's Alex, and that's the story of hundreds of thousands of open source maintainers. So, let's talk about Alex a little bit more. What drives Alex actually to do that? Well, in most cases that we see these days, and people like Alex, they are driven by intrinsic motivation. So they want to do something on their own. They don't want to do that as part of their job or so, and nobody tells them to. They create something. And they do this because perhaps they want to master a new programming language or solve their own needs and so on, and perhaps also because they want to show off in the end, right? I did something cool. Look at it. And there's always a clear purpose behind it. Fixing their own issues perhaps, but perhaps also other people's issues. Why not? And exactly this mentality is what we see a lot in open source projects. And this is also a mentality of because I can. I have the freedom to decide, I can just do it. And I mean, if we look at graphs, how the open source ecosystem is evolving in terms of packages and software and lines of codes, this is exactly showing that there are so many people just doing open source. And that's a cool thing that we didn't have 40 years ago, when creating software was depending on a lot of resources. You had to have internet access. Distributing software was only possible by, or mostly only possible if you got on a CD in a computer magazine. And these days you can just publish it on PyPy and GitHub, and you can just increase the whole universe. And that's great. And that's how most developers or most maintainers are actually starting. So the key word is passion here. They start with passion doing that. So let's look at the evolution of Alex. And Alex tool is really cool. Over the time, the project grows and it attracts other developers who want to use it and also contribute to it. So they start building up a community, actually. And that puts Alex in a different position. They're no longer the one-person team hacking on the project, but actually they're doing something like program management these days. So not program management, sorry, community management. Yeah? They set up a community, they build up rules, perhaps they even have to enforce them, and they turn into what we would call a servant leader. In the best case, a good open source maintainer is a servant leader, serving to their own community and helping it to grow, and putting your own interests where the whole project started, perhaps a little behind, and putting the project in front. So what does a maintainer do? Especially here in the maturity level of Alex. A lot of things, especially since they are no longer just writing their own software, but software for other people and catering more use cases. They are doing loads of things. You have to do architecture, actually. How do I implement a lot of use cases that other people are carrying to me? How do I implement them? Not only from the technical perspective, from the code and the modularity, but also what do I put on my roadmap? What do I prioritize and so on? So I have to do code reviews of the pull requests that are coming in. I have to do administrator, like managing access permissions if I onboard new contributors or even perhaps co-maintainers or so. I have to moderate discussions and deal with the whole social thing of open source, more or less. And that's also a key mentality of open source. It's this meritocratic principle. Those who do the work, they decide. And this is what they also have to implement in their project. And so the currency that we are talking about is reputation. So, and this is quite different from what we may know from corporate worlds, right? So once this community grows and more people are using it, there are also most certainly companies being interested in it and wanting to become part of the community and also to ask for features. And we now see how such a conversation may go. Oh, another call. Oh, who might be that?
Hey there, it's me again.
Hey.
You remember we really need this one feature I told you about.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah? Sounds interesting.
Yeah. So can you implement it before the next release of our product?
I have no idea. Sorry, no idea. No.
Oh,
probably not.
Here's some money.
Okay, bye. Again, you see, that didn't go well either. Just throwing money at open source maintainers probably won't really solve anything. And perhaps that's also one of the differences that we see from the corporate world, where money is perhaps a little bit another motivator, another factor. So we are now speaking about money, or perhaps I should say resources. How do maintainers actually finance their work? And resource-wise, one of the shortest resources is actually time. So we have a lot of projects started by open source maintainers who do that in their spare time, in their free time, after work, on the weekend, in night shifts, or when they're on sick leave. But that's a privilege, of course. That's a privilege to have that time. Many people don't have it because they have a family or have to work quite long and so on. Other projects or other maintainers gather their time during university. So they're starting university projects as part of their thesis or so. And so they're doing something and having time, and because it's part of their job, as you would say. And if you're speaking about jobs, like there are also people working paid on open source. I mean, if I look here in this room, you're probably also part of that. So perhaps you're working on open source or maintaining projects as part of if your company has it like a 20% time. Yeah? So you have the ability to maintain your own project or work on other ones. It could also be that, that you're actually getting paid for maintaining a project because your project is so important to the company or to another program in your company, so they're hiring you. Others are doing open source maintenance, perhaps rather as, you can contribute to projects that are important for your team, for instance, so you can dedicate some time on it. And if you're speaking about more like these more independent projects that are not based in companies, how do we get money or how do maintainers get money? Well, of course, the most obvious thing is donations. So there are pretty good platforms in order to get donations, or there's GitHub sponsors and so on. There's crowdsourcing, things like bug bounties or so, or you can get even funding. Research funding, but perhaps also public funding, things like Sovereign Tech Fund or NGI Zero or so, where open source projects are getting supported in the maintainers. So that's great. We have some ideas here. But that also creates challenges, right? Throwing money at people is creating challenges, and it may change the dynamics how things are working. Yeah, it may influence the independence of an open source project. Like once money is there, it might switch the motivation from being more intrinsic to extrinsic. Perhaps as a maintainer, I'm no longer interested, or I have other motivations to no longer work on issues that I find most interesting, or where I have the most thumbs up in an issue, but for which I'm getting paid. And that's fair as well. I mean, maintainers also have to pay their rents. And once money is involved, administrativa also come into play. I have to pay taxes. If I even onboard, other freelancers, I have to pay them salaries and get involved into that. So money changes a lot of things, but in many cases it's necessary in order to continue the project. So we always have to ask ourselves, what are the incentives that people are actually maintaining projects? Especially perhaps when they're coming from a very corporate background, or if these are corporate sponsored projects. The incentives might be different from more traditional open source projects coming from communities. So let's get back to Alex. And as you know from Greek drama, the third act is the one where the action intensifies. So the project from Alex, it grows, and it creates another huge set of challenges, right? Because there's now a friction between corporations that are involved in the community and the more original open source community that are perhaps more composed of hobbyists or people that are using that in their private time. So here Alex has a huge pile of work before them because they have to balance between these different stakeholders. You want to keep the independence of the project, you want to be open to partnerships, to also getting funding perhaps, but still you don't want to lose the independence of the project, and you don't want to scare away the community or the more hobbyist contributors or the people that pushed up the whole project in the first place. So that's a really hard challenge, and we see many open source projects failing at this stage as well. Because money is involved, and that changes a lot of things, and that often creates forks because the rest of the community feels pushed away and not being ignored. So this here is really hard work for maintainers, and we see that there's a lot of social skills involved, and the traditional coding skills are no longer really required, or these are not the essential parts that keep the project running. And if we look at this dynamic between companies and open source maintainers, there's a lot to learn, and there are a lot of differences that we have to be aware of. And I think this is one of the key slides here, which still many people don't understand from both worlds. So there are cultural differences that we can see. Reputation is very different, and in open source it's rather earned by the things that I'm doing. You remember this meritocratic principle, those who do the work. In companies it's different. In many cases, rather the hierarchy is defining whether I have the status or whether I can decide something. And therefore also the processes are different. In open source many things are a lot more ad hoc, while in companies I have project plans and have Gantt diagrams and so on. So that changes things. And it also changes the resources or influences the resources that I have. In my company time I can work from 9 to 5 in many contexts. While in open source, I do the rest of the day, basically. Or I have only a few hours on the weekend to work on my project. And that, of course, changes things. How I, as a maintainer, interact with the community, interact with the project, and where it set priorities. And I think in order to bring together these two areas a little bit more and to create more understanding, I think both sides have to move a little bit or understand a little bit. For companies, it's very important to have the courage and the ability to constructively lose control. Many companies are used to having control because they have money and they have plans and they have direct feedback and they can cancel things. With open source, it doesn't really work that way. We know that. But maintainers who want to stay open and be open to this collaboration and work together with companies constructively, they have to have more patience with the corporate culture. I mean, corporations are often much slower than open sources. Decisions are made in a different way. So this culture cannot be easily changed. And it hopefully adapts over time and comes closer. But at this point, still there's a lot of patience needed. And so these two groups have to learn to better understand each other. So let's see, how does Alex's story progress? Actually, quite good. So their project runs over a long time, and now a very important point in time has come for the project. It's actually passing on the baton, passing on the maintainership to someone else. Because let's face reality, maintainers perhaps lose interest in a project, or they change jobs, or they have family and they have other priorities, or they are just bored with the project. And many projects die at this stage, where they just say, well, then I just quit silently from GitHub or from the project. But a good maintainer tries to end this engagement graciously, finding a successor that don't only have the coding skills, but perhaps also the skills to lead this community here. And yeah, that's of course a very emotional step. Imagine, or perhaps you had the experience of building up something, a project over years with sweat and tears, and now you have to give it away. But that's really important, yeah? That's really an important part of in open source projects here. But fortunately, everything works out smoothly. So they pass on the maintainership and find a good successor, and the community still values them as an important part of this community, and they are still invited and so on. And years later, Alex is invited to a conference and is being asked about the success factors for this successful project. And they say, well, the most important part is that a good maintainer is not the boss, but actually servant leader of the community. And that the true value of an open source project lies in the people and the people who contribute, no matter whether they're hobbyists as well or whether they're coming from corporations. So this is where open source is the strong part here. That's the community factor. And so a servant leader tries to keep that alive. And this is a great story by Alex, right? I mean, this is an awesome maintainer, and we would love to have more of them. But we have to bear in mind that maintainers are not always the same, and we have many facets of open source maintainers these days. So there are a number of differences, right? Especially in motivation. If I'm doing open source and open source maintenance as part of my paid job, I'm having a different motivation than when I'm doing this during my university time or so, or whether I'm doing this in my spare time on the weekends. And success can look very different in those scenarios. So if I'm doing this as part of my thesis, a success is when the project is working, I'm writing my thesis, the paper is published, and then I'm ending the project perhaps, and I'm no longer touching it. And it can still be in the successful open source project for them. So we have to understand the motivation behind open source projects if we want to properly assess it. Funding is also very different. I mean, we are talking from the whole bandwidth of I'm a 100% open source developer working at a big open source company, or I'm doing this, I don't know, in my spare time because I have no touch in my work with open source, and all the gray areas in between. Yeah? And that also changes governance. Most open source projects are governed ad hoc, so there's no structure behind it. Other projects are a little bit more structured, but still informal. Perhaps they even had elections or so. And then, of course, a project can also be part of a huge foundation, like a Cloud Native Computing Foundation or any other, where there's a lot of formalism, which is also good, perhaps, for open source projects. So these are some of the differences, and there are many more, of course. But I think there are also a lot of similarities that we can see. Most open source maintainers have a high sense of responsibility, no matter where they are coming from. And they do this because they want to be autonomously to work that, because that's the whole value of open source. And maintainers have to have the sense of balancing interests. And it doesn't matter who's involved in, as soon as you have more than one person involved, you are balancing interests, basically. And that's a very important part in maintaining open source. And I said it already, like this role of being a servant leader, this is what we are aiming towards to. And this is what we are also, if we are doing open source in our context, and no matter whether it's as a hobbyist or in a corporation, then yeah, this is the role model that we should have, in my opinion. So, let's see, how would good interaction between companies and maintainers look like?
Hey there.
Hey.
So we would like to contribute this useful feature to your tool. Would you like to have a look at it?
Yeah, sure. I just have some change requests, but otherwise great.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We will implement them and then open a pull request, okay?
Yeah, great. Excellent. We'll be in a part of the next release then.
Woo, great.
Yeah. Bye-bye. And this is how good interactions should look like in the ideal world. And this is what I hope that you will also do in your daily jobs if you're interacting with open source maintainers. Yeah? We are part of the community as companies. So with this, I'm ending the talk. I'm opening the floor to drinks and barbecue, unless you have any other questions. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I will be here for the rest of the day. Unfortunately, tomorrow not. So if you're having other ideas or other experiences with working with open source maintainers and good ideas how we can improve that, please ask here on the in front of the stage or afterwards during barbecue. Thank you.
Thanks. So, okay, in the spirit of a barbecue, normally you have a burger. A farmer raised a cow and went to the butcher or the metzgerei, and you give them cash, and you get food. In the examples he showed me, there was nothing really about, who pays the maintainer. I mean, how are they getting compensated for the time they invest? Because they, like anyone else here, has to put food on the table. And one of the things I'd love to understand your opinion on is, is there any advice you have on, like this small contribution? I'm sure in Deutsche Bahn there's a lot of open source projects running OT systems, so safety critical systems, which from a corporate environment means, okay, I have a liability. I usually exchange some money as an SLA. And so there's not just this piece of code that needs to run, there's the whole mechanism behind it. How available can that maintainer be there when there's a bug detected? How, who can I call when there's a sense of urgency? Because, like you mentioned, they could be contributing in the weekend, they could be, have another full-time job, and the project might not be directly related to their actual employment. So,
yeah, I mean, you're actually pointing to the obvious issue that we are having, and I think that's most companies are having actually when interacting with projects and with open source. I feel that, and I hope I stated that with the second video, is just throwing money at projects doesn't really solve anything. Because that was one of the fast reactions that we saw also during the last XZ utils case. And people are saying, well, we have to pay maintainers. So people are jumping, yeah, where can we get money? Like, who can we give money to? And I think this changes dynamics. And I know many open source maintainers, I'm one of also open source maintainer. I wouldn't want to take money, actually, because it puts me in a different position, perhaps. So I think, first of all, if we want to, as companies or as any organization that wants to foster open source, we first have to think about, like, what do we want to foster, actually? Do we want to support the whole open source community, like in the whole? like everything, then I have perhaps can become member of a foundation or so, or I can put money into funds. Like for instance, the sovereign tech fund is now getting more private, so open for private money. That could be a way where I can just spread around, investing money and hoping that something happens and for the better. But I can also try to identify open source projects that are critical to me as a company, so I can make it more like an economic decision, perhaps. Like saying, well, this is critical to me, so I'm investing there. So now I have to get to understand the project better, like who's the maintainer, what they are doing, what are their motivations, and then trying to identify, does money help? Or perhaps it's better if I ask some of my developers, do you want to become a co-maintainer of the project? Do you want to contribute something? Should a new feature be implemented, or better, can we somehow contribute long-term maintenance or so? And I think this is a very individual case, so we have to do this case by case. I'm quite convinced of that. So of course we can send some big money and hoping that it somehow reaches the right persons, but I think it's also important to identify these critical projects where I want to spend time on. And perhaps if I'm if part of my supply chain is a project for which the maintainer doesn't want to accept any contributions, or doesn't want to accept any money, and it's in my safety critical application, I think we as companies should also have the courage to say, well, then it's not the right project that we are using here. Perhaps we should find an alternative here. So we are part of an ecosystem here, and I think we should understand it better, and I still feel that many companies, and also organizations, and also the LinkedIn top voices that you can read, they're actually not really understanding how the community works in many cases.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Max, for the presentation.
Thanks a lot.